If you're wondering what taking a class with me is like, it's a bit like this. It's nice to just interact with more people. And someone said, a lot of us are just hungry for some more intellectual type conversation about these myths rather than, maybe what you find mostly on TikTok or something. Because I've been talking about Celtic mythology publicly for a long time, it's sometimes difficult to find a new way to present the same material. So this is kind of beginner material that we're looking at today in a way that, is helpful to the newbies and my regulars don't get bored. So sometimes all I can do is try to improve the old stuff and rearrange it a bit. Sometimes I wreck things by trying to do that, but you can only try. I usually learn a few things by doing stuff like that. So hopefully you'll learn something from this tech talk, even if you're not at all new. And if you're new, I think you probably will. So I do what I do because I want to see our stories and our other lore kept alive. I want people to hear the stories and I want to point them to where they can find them. So I know when you show up for a free talk, one question you have is this going to be mostly the speaker trying to sell me something? So the answer tonight or today is no, but yeah, just a little. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just get that bit out of the way. So I'm going to spend about 4 minutes showing you my wares, and then we don't have to think about it anymore. So you probably know that I teach Celtic mythology classes. I really enjoy being able to help people get more confident and better understand these old stories and their context. But I try not to be overly serious about it, as hopefully you can see from this joke. This includes introductory classes like Intro to Celtic Mythology, which I'll be teaching again in like February or something, and Mabinogi Connections, which again I'll be teaching toward the beginning of next year again. I teach classes focused on just one or two deities like Manannan and beyond, or Mabon, Modron, and Maponos. And I teach classes looking at particular pieces of literature like Taliesin Connections, which is about the book of Taliesin, or Meeting the Tua de Danann in the Camoi Tuera. If you want to have a look at all the classes I teach, there's a link for that in the handout. But I've got 4 classes starting in the next week or so. So Shapeshifters and Magical Animals is to do with stories of people who experience transformation into animal forms, whether they do this on purpose or it happens by some other means. And many of these stories from Wales and Ireland have a strong mystical side, and we'll be concentrating on that quite a bit. This is an easy course to get you started with me or with Celtic mythology. It's very beginner friendly, but I think it would be interesting to people who have quite a long background in Celtic myth as well. There's no outside reading for this class, and it's pay what you can. So all the upcoming classes have 6 sessions over about 7 weeks because there's a break around Samhain. The price range for this class is from $30 for the 6 weeks up to $110. You pick your price, which works out from about $5 a session up to about 18. And then there's Looking for Lugus. This was a new class last year. And this class looks at what we know about Lugus and the Lugoves on the continent, and then begins to dig into the Irish and Welsh literature about Lugh and Llay and some other Brythonic reflexes. So there's some reading for this class. All the reading is available online, so you don't need to buy anything extra. And this one's full price, $95 for 6 weeks, or $85 if you're already a paying patron. And near and dear to my heart, Mabon, Modron, and Maponos. I'm sure some of you know how I feel about all this. This is a deep dive into these 3 deities and some others that we consider to be their reflexes, including Matrona and Boan and Angus and Cunomaglos and others. These deities are pretty central to my spiritual life, and I really enjoy studying them and sharing the latest things I've uncovered every year. There's some new things. So this class does have some outside reading for some weeks, as does the Lugas class. And this one is also pay what you can, same price. So you can also just come to the opening session, the Mysteries of Mabon, as a standalone event. And there are some free tickets left for that standalone event class. All three of these classes that I've mentioned are pretty beginner friendly. You don't need to worry about whether you know enough to participate. The fourth class is the Triads of Britain. And there are some requirements for this one. You really need some knowledge of the Mabinogion stories and some knowledge of the Brythonic Old North, who some of the main players are in that world. Irian of Freged and Owain, and the different kings and things that are famous from stories of the Old North. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then clearly, you don't know that stuff yet, and that's fine. But if you have all that, you'll love this class. If you're a quick study and maybe you know the Mabinogion pretty well, but not about the Old North, I can help you get ready. This class starts on the 5th of September, so you need to be quick. This class also uses a textbook, Trioedd Ynys Prydain by Rachel Bromwich. And the book is currently between printings, but you can get an ebook. So this class requires some reading and independent study, and it expects you to share your findings with the class each week. So it's a bit demanding. It's what I call a full participation class. So I encourage students to make the effort to come to the weekly Zoom sessions and not just consume my courses digitally from the recordings. But you can consume my courses digitally in most cases, but not the Triads class. You have to show up and share in that class. So let's move on. Now, Celtic mythology. Celtic in this context means the people who speak or formerly spoke a Celtic language. So I do not consider, and academia does not consider, Celtic to be something to do with your genetics. That's not what I mean when I say Celtic. I'm talking about a language group. And by extension, to some extent, then that implies cultural groups, right? So Celtic people are likely to share some of the same mythology. Basically, Britain, Ireland, and Gaul. When we think about mythology, coming to the word mythology, we're thinking about stories of gods, maybe legends of very ancient heroes, cultural heroes who perhaps have supernatural interactions, stories about cosmology or about the origin of a group of people. Oh, we came to this land in ships long ago, or we're all descended from our great matriarch, or whatever. Yeah. So mythology is this it's different than folklore, and people are very confused about that. And in different disciplines, like academic disciplines, the words mythology and folklore are used differently. So I'm just telling you how I use it. And I think a lot of people use it the way I do, but not everyone. So folklore usually features more everyday type people. They may also have supernatural experiences. They might get a bag of gold or get frightened out of their wits or something, but things still feel a little bit more mundane. Folklore is also different from mythology in how fast it changes. It's passed quickly from person to person. People change the story to suit the occasion, or because they misunderstood it or can't quite remember what the last guy said to them. So localities, a village, a group of villages, whatever, may have people who are kind of dedicated storytellers, maybe an older person or somebody who travels a little, like a fisherman or a tradesman who know a lot of stories, and that person will often preserve the best versions of stories, and sometimes it's handed down in their family. But folklore is kind of viral. It morphs and shifts to suit the moment much more quickly. Mythology, on the other hand, changes at this really kind of glacial rate. Historically, there was a serious professional class of what we might call memory workers, such as druids or special poets who memorized things and passed them on word for word. The myths still changed, but they didn't change as quickly. It's possible that some of our earlier medieval manuscripts that have mythological stories in them are the end result of that memory project that had been going on for a couple of millennia, right? People finally started writing stuff down. Of course, supporting a small army of full-time memory workers who aren't producing anything else, or even a bunch of medieval scribes, it's expensive. The memory workers were supported by the nobility, and most of the stories we find are about noble people, not tradesmen and farmers. The gods are also represented as living in a way which was similar to the nobility, which is likely how everyone imagined them, not just the nobility. Their lives are very lavish, occasionally their clothing or their dwellings are described, and they're all in silk and jewels and living in palaces. So Wales and Ireland are the two countries which really managed to preserve Celtic language mythology of the kind I've just been talking about. Scotland and other countries that are Celtic speaking mainly have folklore. And some people prefer to call what we think of as Celtic mythology, the stuff that got preserved in medieval manuscripts. They prefer to call it medieval literature and argue that it's not proper mythology, whatever that is. So I think that's a fair point sometimes, but in a way, all mythology is a form of literature. So we're just looking at another fuzzy distinction. Most of us, when we talk about Celtic mythology, mean things like the Irish Ulster Cycle or Book of Invasions, or the four branches of the Mabinogi from Wales, or Cilch and Annwfn. And generally speaking, I'd say the Irish stuff feels a little bit more mythological, and the Welsh feels a little bit more like a literary echo of mythology. There are various scholarly points of view about all that. It's definitely literary, the Mabinogi, for example, but scratch the surface and you can see the mythology is still under there. So I decided that this session would be too long if I ran through the best resources in real time. I will post it on Patreon. So you should be able to get at it that way by going to my Patreon. So you've tracked down the story you want to read, let's say, and your first problem may be the names. So pronouncing Welsh and Irish names is a challenge until you're used to them. So some books will have a guide to pronunciation. And I promise you that even though you're just reading to yourself out of a book, it's worth trying to nail those pronunciations in your head as best you can, or even practice saying them out loud. Write them in the margins of the text next to where the names occur in the story. Like the first 3 times, the name Rhiannon appears, write how to pronounce it. If you can't bear to write in your book, use post-it notes. They won't hurt your book. Getting the names right or close means that they don't all run together in your head. Because otherwise, if you're not familiar with the language, a lot of the names look a bit alike, and you will get confused about who's who quite quickly. So having a name that you know how to say gives a character an identity. It also means you can talk about the story with a bit more confidence and understand other people when they talk about the stories. So I've noticed a few times in some of my classes, I've been blithely talking about things with Celtic names, only to find out that people weren't really following the lecture because they weren't putting together what they were hearing me say with what they had been seeing on the page. The next problem is that medieval language and style is very different than the modern fiction we're used to. Translations often reflect that, which isn't a bad thing. We want some flavor of the original, right? But it takes some getting used to. There's not much description. Events can be very compressed. So this is the opening of The Voyage of Bran, son of Pwyll, and his expedition here below. That is the title the translator has given this, which must be what it says in the medieval manuscript. And this is a mid-19th century translation. 'Twas 50 quatrains the woman from unknown lands sang on the floor of the house to Bran, son of Pwyll, when the royal house was full of kings, who knew not whence the woman had come, since the ramparts were closed. This is the beginning of the story. One day in the neighborhood of his stronghold, Bran went about alone when he heard music behind him, and often as he looked back, 'twas still behind him that the music was, and so on. So you can see or hear that the sentence structure isn't what we're used to. And we're just pitched into the action without much explanation. The story starts, and then in the second paragraph, it says, this is the beginning of the story. Things aren't explained. You will be able to figure it out. You will. But you might have to read the opening couple of pages a few times before it begins to make sense. Give yourself the time and the grace to do that. Or, you can get some help from somebody like me in a class or in a book. So I'm going to just share one more little snippet of the beginning of a story. This is a modern translation from the Mabinogion by Shauna Davies. So this is the beginning of how Cilhwch won Olwen. Cilith, son of Celethon Wledig. Now, Wledig is a word which means like leader or ruler. So Celethon Wledig wanted a wife as well-born as himself. The woman he wanted was Golaidith, daughter of Annwfn Wledig. After he had slept with her, the country went to prayer to see whether they might have an heir. And they had a son through the country's prayers. And from the hour she became pregnant, she went mad and did not go near any dwelling. When her time came, her senses returned to her. This happened in a place where a swineherd was tending a herd of pigs. And out of fear of the pigs, the queen gave birth, and so on. So it's typical that the opening paragraph of a story is going to have a lot of names crowded into it. Often we get the genealogy of the main character or something like that. And you're just like, already, I'm done. This isn't for me. I'm out of here. But if you kind of just trust the process, the story will start. So that can just feel really scary. Happily, Shauna Davies gives you a pronunciation guide, so use it. And once again, we don't know anything about these characters. Who are they? What are they thinking? A novel would tell us what they're thinking. What do they look like? A film, we would see them. Why does Goliath go mad? It's just kind of, you have to trust the story. This is a medieval author's idea of exposition. Often, let's go. So there's rarely any insight into what characters think or feel or why they do things. So rather than looking for characters to identify with, which is what modern fictions and films encourage us to do, right? We're taught to imagine we're the hero or the beautiful heroine or the relatable clumsy person. You need to look at the story more as a whole. What makes the story tick? What's the big picture? This is where you get the juicy bits out of mythology. So I often find that people choose deities that they want to interact with based on the ones they identify with in myths. Not always, but it's quite common. And while that's not wrong, I think it causes us often to kind of project ourselves onto that deity or that figure in mythology rather than paying attention, to the myth itself. And the bigger canvas of ideas that the myth is painting on are really often what we need to be taking in. So that's a bit tricky without an example, but I'm going to tell a story soon, and you can practice doing that, and we'll talk about it. I think the other way readers of mythology get things wrong is just by reading too fast. Like the whole of the Mabinogion. If you can see that, it's a really normal sized little paperback. That's the whole thing. Some of you could easily read it in a weekend, I'm sure, but I'd wager that you won't feel like you got much out of it. Just that it's very strange, it felt disjointed, you're not sure you get why people think this is a great cultural treasure. But imagine living in a culture where these stories are told over and over. Maybe you hear them on an annual basis or more often than that. They kind of live in your head, these stories. And you kind of feel like you might be starting to live in the stories a little bit. As readers of Celtic mythology, people engaging with print, this can be hard to recreate. One thing you can do is to go back over stories or parts of stories often, either because you didn't get it and you didn't get it, or because you loved it. When you find something tasty on the menu, order it again. If you find yourself thinking about the Dagda eating the huge pot of porridge, or about Rhiannon on her lovely white horse, go read it again, slowly and carefully, and give yourself some time and space to contemplate it. Allow the meaning to come to you, or seek out some commentary from others about what it might mean. Some of the books on your list are books of commentary about Celtic mythology, while others are books of Celtic mythology collections, So try to get to the point with favorite stories where you could tell them. Now, maybe you're too shy to tell them out loud to your friends, but could you tell it to yourself in your head um, while you're going for a walk or falling asleep at night? Can you remember the sequence of events in the story? That's how you need to engage with mythology to really get the meat off the bones. So I'm going to tell you a story. One that I'm guessing a lot of you will have heard, but that's fine. That's good, right? So I'm going to put my memory worker's head on for this. I'm not going to make the story more dramatic than it is in the medieval text, which I might do if I was just telling it for fun. I'm going to try and keep the pacing similar too, so that it's a bit like what you'd find in a translation. And that way, you can practice paying attention to what happens rather than starting to identify with your favorite main character. So try to keep your objectivity as much as you can. So this is a story from Wales, set in the southwest of Wales, in a kingdom called Dyfed. The ruler of Dyfed was called Pwyll. He was known as the Prince of Dyfed, though not as its king. One day he got the urge to go hunting. So he gathered his hounds and his huntsmen, and he set out that very evening to a wild place on the fringes of Dyfed called Glen Cych. And they passed the night nearby, and in the morning they were up at dawn to hunt. Pwyll and his dogs got separated from his companions, and soon he could hear another pack of dogs, sounding as if they had been successful. Well, he came upon a clearing, and sure enough, there was a pack of dogs already feeding on a stag they had brought down. So imagine like big greyhound kind of dogs. Yeah. They weren't ordinary dogs, they were bright white with very red ears. Being in his own territory, the stag belonged to Pwyll, the ruler, by rights, and he began to drive these strange dogs off. Get out of here. And he allowed his own dogs to feed on the stag. And then the owner of the other pack appeared, a man dressed in gray hunting garb, riding a huge dapple gray horse. I know you, but I won't greet you, said the rider. Perhaps your rank is higher than mine, said Pwyll. The huntsman explained that it wasn't a question of rank, but of rudeness. The stag was his. He told Pwyll that his name was Arawn, and he was the king of Annwfn, that is, the other world. Pwyll now understood his mistake. This guy's a king, and a supernatural one at that, and he wanted to make amends and be friends. But rather than demanding some kind of payment, which would be typical in this time, Annwfn had a slightly different plan. He said, "There is a king in the territory bordering mine who I am constantly at war with. You can easily defeat him, and if you do, you will win my friendship." So Pwyll, the young hero, agreed. Annwfn went on, "I'll give you the most beautiful woman in the world to sleep with every night," said Annwfn, "and I'll put you in my place and my exact likeness so that no one in my court will know that you are not me. And I will assume your appearance and rule Dyfed in your place, and you will not be missed." So Pwyll agreed to this strange plan, and Annwfn went on to tell him about the battle he must fight. "My foe is called Havgan," he said. "Go and fight him at the ford 1 year from today. But you must give him only one blow. If you do, he won't survive it. But he will beg you to strike him again. And if you do, you cannot defeat him." So Pwyll found himself riding up to Annwfn's palace in the otherworld, and everyone greeted him as their beloved king. No one knew that he wasn't Annwfn. He was bathed and dressed and sat at a table with the nobles, with the most beautiful woman he had ever seen at his side. Her conversation was as fine as her appearance, and the food and the entertainment was the best he had ever experienced. Soon, though, it was time for bed, and Pwyll went to the bedchamber and got into bed with the queen, and then he turned his back to her and paid no attention to her. And this went on for the whole year. By day, they were the best of friends, but by night he was cold and silent. And the queen, thinking that this was her husband, was troubled by it, but said nothing. As for Pwyll, he spent the year hunting and drinking and eating and enjoying himself until the year was up. When the day for the fight came, the men of the court went with him, prepared for battle, but it was to be single combat between Pwyll and Havgan. So they stood aside to see what would happen. Immediately, Havgan appeared. Pwyll split his shield and armor with a mighty blow, wounding him badly. Havgan cried that Pwyll had no reason to attack him so, since it was not really his fight. And then he begged Pwyll to put him out of his agony and make his death swift. And Pwyll would not, remembering Annwfn's words, and Havgan's men carried their dying leader away. For his part, Pwyll began collecting tribute and fealty from the people of Havgan's kingdom, and Annwfn's men declared that he was king of all Annwfn now. So Pwyll returned to Glencirch and met with Annwfn again, who put them each back in their own shape and appearance. "And when you get back to your own kingdom, you'll see what I've done for you," said Annwfn to Pwyll. Annwfn soon returned home as if nothing had happened, enjoyed an evening's feasting with his people, and took his wife to bed. They enjoyed one another greatly that night. But then the queen became strangely silent. "What's wrong?" said Annwfn. "I don't know," she replied. "What's been wrong for the past year that you have been so cold and silent each night and turned your back to me? And now you're suddenly amorous again." Annwfn thought to himself that Pwyll had been much more loyal a friend than he had expected, and he told his queen the whole story, and they were both amazed by Pwyll's behavior. As for Pwyll, when he got home, what he did was to call his men together and ask them if they had been happy with his rule during the past year. Oh, they are very enthusiastic in telling him that he had been a better ruler by far than he had been in previous years. Ouch. And when Pwyll heard that, he said that he would continue to rule in the way they had become accustomed in that year. And he told them what had happened as well. And after that, Pwyll, Prince of Dyfed, became known as Pwyll, Chief of Annwfn. So I'm going to share with you now just a few of my own ideas about this story. Of course, these are opinions, but they're informed opinions, informed by other scholarship and lots of thinking about the story. So the idea of a monarch or leader having a supernatural seal of approval is a common theme. There are lots of stories where this happens. Pwyll's status is greatly increased by his positive encounter with Arawn and his trip to the otherworld. Many Celtic myths feel like they have layers of material as you dig down. You find different things. You begin to develop the ability to recognize the medieval layer and kind of see what's under it like an archaeologist, you know? I suspect that the stuff about Pwyll's loyalty and chivalry toward the queen may be a later layer, and the real substance of the meaning could be a little bit hidden by medieval ideas. What looks like chivalry can also look like Pwyll prudishly rejecting the advances of a sovereignty goddess. Maybe the myth once ran differently, and he did sleep with her, and it no longer fit the sensibilities of the age in which the Mabinogi was written down. We'll never know for sure. If you're familiar with his story, you know that Pwyll soon meets Rhiannon, another otherworldly woman who appears mysteriously in his kingdom and becomes his queen. Is this the otherworld trying again to get Pwyll hooked up with his sovereignty goddess because he blew it the first time? Or should we go with the loyalty and chivalry interpretation? I don't know. I'll be happy to answer questions, but I've got a couple for you guys before that. So feel free to chip in and don't be shy, and don't worry, there's no right or wrong answers. I just want to hear what you think. So first, there are many stories where kings travel to the other world, and they often return with supernatural treasures or wisdom, which makes them better rulers. What do you think Pwyll learns from his experience? What wisdom does he gain, if any?
He learns restraint.
He learns restraint. Okay, so you're talking about when he's sleeping with the queen, or something else?
It could be that, but also the restraint of only giving the one blow to Havgan.
Yes, yes. So I can imagine a man in battle, you know, the testosterone is going, the adrenaline is going, you know, and you just want to like bash the crap out of the guy now, don't you? Yeah, but he doesn't. He follows the supernatural instructions and stops at one blow. That's a really good point.
Well, I think that Queef is not a usual man because he accepts that he didn't do the best job of taking care of his people and learned the lesson. So I was surprised at that because that's not, in my view, not typical of men.
Yeah, there are a number of Irish stories in particular. I'm thinking of things like Cormac in the Otherworld, where wisdom is imparted to a ruler to make him a better ruler. It's interesting that the method of delivery here is unusual in that he doesn't get all the wisdom while he's in the other world. He gets it by his men describing to him how he's ruled them in the past year. I mean, we have to kind of imagine that he then says, well, what was great about Around's rule that you liked? You know, what was he a fairer judge? Was he more generous? What did he do that was better?
I do see he's not just learning restraint, but he's also seeing that there's might be more ways to handle the situation than just to strike what's before you.
Mm-hmm. Not to be just too direct line, bash your way through. Yeah. So I've got another question. Did you gain any wisdom? Were there any points in the story where you felt like Pwyll was taking the wrong action? Did you learn anything about leadership or the other world? Do you feel you got something out of the story? Or maybe you learned something by watching about how the story unfolded.
I'm always intrigued by the way that Pwyll lets himself get entangled in Arawn's war but he doesn't seem to have any interest in figuring out the nature of it. He's just like, well, I owe this guy, so I'm going to do what he said to do. Because especially he has the line, I may come to regret not giving you the second blow. And it's just, to me, that would be something where it's like, it would have been interesting to see any other context around that, but we just don't get that.
Yeah, I think those of us who are familiar with this story and curious about Havgan, we just wish we knew a bit more about him. I found myself, sometimes kind of like, I feel a bit sorry for Havgan. Why is he the problem? We have to accept that, we can't see what's behind the curtain sometimes.
I didn't learn anything new. I've only read the story once, kind of intently, but I walked away with more questions. Why
Mm,
is it that Pwyll has to be the one to strike him down? Why is it not Annwfn that can only strike him once? What's preventing that from happening in the story?
yeah, I have some thoughts about that, but I'm going to try and hold them just for a moment.
Not really necessarily teach me something, but reinforce something I've been learning. Sometimes, like there's the way that Pwyll thinks he's at the top of the totem pole, and is then sort of informed he isn't, and by becoming subservient, he actually learns like quite a lot. And by the time he's actually home again, he's obviously able to be a better king, right? Due to his
Mm-hmm.
humble nature. And yeah, questions as well. It seemed like I can't remember the name of the person he stroked down, but you were saying that why are you here? Like you're not even supposed to be here. Like he strike me again, right? So it seems like the spell of glamour was not consistent with the enemy, only within the kingdom, and I'm wondering why that is.
Yes, well, I guess I think about that a lot too. Havgan being a king in Annwfn, it's interesting now. If you read it carefully, he's described as a king in Annwfn, while Arawn styles himself king of Annwfn. So that's something to think about. What's that all about? He's obviously a rival of some sort or an interloper as Arawn sees it. But yeah, being, I guess, a supernatural sort of character, he clearly sees that Pwyll is not around, although no one else can see it. Yeah, that's a really great point.
I find a weird parallel between how Pui, both times he encounters the other world, it's both on a horse. He meets Annwfn on a horse, and he meets Rhiannon first on a horse, chasing after her multiple times.
Well, horses are a great sovereignty symbol. It's clearer in some ways in other places. And I teach a class called the Celtic Horse Goddesses every year where we go deep, deep into that. That one's coming up toward the end of the year. So I think that's a great observation.
Could on one level Pwyll and Aaron be one and the same person, or different levels of consciousness or awareness? In mind of the king and the land, and many myths being one, maybe a bit esoteric, but
This this is why I love teaching, because people come up with stuff that I haven't thought of before. Even yeah, how long have I been teaching the Mapinogi? Yeah, so their identities certainly become entangled, don't they? Does that imply that somehow they're two sides of a coin, reflexive of one another? Because it's really interesting that Puig retains this kind of secondary title as chief of Annwfn. Now, of course, Arawn continues to live on. We know from the fourth branch, where he's mentioned again, he's not really a character, but he's mentioned again as sending gifts to Puig's son, Pryderi. So he's obviously still ruling in Annwfn in the fourth branch. So how are they both chief of Annwfn? Because it's mythology. And you have to live with some unanswerable questions.
but the whole story gives a feeling of that the concept of the story was made to give you the morals of the story, to teach you the moral of kingship or honesty
indecency in a number of different stories. It's like the whole story is to give you a life lesson.
If I may respond to that just slightly with a little bit of pushback, kind of, but not really.
That's cool.
There's a theory about the Mabinogi in particular, and maybe Celtic mythology more generally, but certainly in the Mabinogi, the four branches of the Mabinogi in particular, that these stories were used to educate young men, young noblemen who might become leaders of some kind, but not so much in the way like a Grimm's fairy tale, which might say, and the moral of the story is this. They don't do that. They particularly don't do that. They expect you to think about the hard questions which are raised in the story and think, what would I do? And what would be the outcome if I did? It's more making you a strategist and someone who develops a sense of ethics than telling you your ethics must be this.
Exactly.
Great. Yeah. So we're in agreement.
I guess mine's kind of a two-part question. One is, did Wales have like a sort of similar thing where you would have like a high king and like petty kings underneath the high king?
It certainly had lots of little petty kingdoms, but I don't think the Britain or Wales, because when does Wales start to exist? Did event when you draw the line and say, okay, that's Wales over there. For a long time it was just part of Britain. There wasn't a high king of Britain for a long, long time. And even, as you know, there are high kings in Irish mythology who are said to be maybe the high king. They're at Tara and so on. From a political point of view, they weren't really high kings. I mean, Brian Boru tries to claim that he's the high king, but even then, a lot of guys are saying, oh, no, you're not.
Yeah.
I'll bring you down a peg.
So the second part of my question is like, Havgan, right? Do we actually see him die, or does he like die off camera?
He dies off camera. Yeah.
Okay, so what if like this is kind of like a contrived thing, and he's not actually supposed to die, and that's why there's only one blow?
Well, there's a school of thought. So Havgan's name means something like summer bright. Around's name does not mean winter, so let's not get carried away, right? But there is a school of thought that maybe this represents a seasonal battle between summer and winter, or maybe I think more likely, an old story somewhere back in the past about a seasonal battle between two kings representing summer and winter might have kind of found its way into the bits of spare parts that are used to build this story. Might be a better way to look at it. That it's quite possible that the reason you can't kill Havgan is because you can't kill him.
This one's a two-parter as well. To the historical aspect of petty kings in what we call Wales, all the way into what we call the Viking period, so about 900 to 1200-ish, right around that period, they were still small petty kingdoms, small tribes, but they didn't have a cohesive kingdom system. That wouldn't come until much later after Anglo-Norman conquest.
Yeah, exactly.
And the second part is answering the killing blow on Hathgan. It's entirely possible you can't truly die in the other world, maybe, potentially, since it's the other part of existence.
I absolutely agree. That's another good insight. Yeah, we assume that the people of the other world are immortals.
High kings and low kings. I mean, that's been an ongoing thing in Ireland for many hundreds of years. I mean, there are people still today who claim to be 35th in line to the throne of the High King of Ireland in the different counties. So there were different sort of claimants to kingships, who weren't really kingships. They were just trying to get claimants to land. But going back to Wales, I don't know about it from the Welsh perspective, but in the Anglo-Saxon period, so we've got from around, say, about 500, maybe 600 up to up to the arrival of the Vikings, that there is a mention of in their documents of discussions with kingdoms in Wales. So kingdoms going in the like in the Old North. So we do have that discussion of kingdoms, not necessarily kings or high kings. I think they viewed kingdoms the same as ownership of land. You know, this is our bit of land. And this is when the conversion period was happening in sort of like around about the 700s when they offered that they wouldn't take the land away from you if you converted to Christianity. You know, so it was very much a land-based thing rather than a kingdom as in the perception that we have kings today.
This thing of Pwyll being the prince of Dyfed, the word is more analogous to princedom, really, which is a word we don't hear very much, but it implies that kind of idea that we have a bunch of principalities, basically, and not
Yeah.
not a king quite in the sense that we think of, a guy in a robe on a throne with a crown.
That princedom, that kingdoms in Wales, but there were no kings per se.
Yeah.
From the Anglo-Saxon text, that is.
It's really great to hear thoughtful conversation, intellectually and scholarly, like in this space of Celtic mythology. I'm reading up on commentary of the Mabinogion by Caitlin Matthews, and follow your YouTube channel. Glad to take part in the convo. I'm wondering if there is any significance to some of the characters in the Mabinogion in like ancestral history of people in Britain and Ireland, and if people claim descendants from the kings or kind of royal lineages mentioned in these stories.
Yes. I don't know about modern people. I know, there are these awful websites, mostly run by Mormons, that often have these really spurious genealogical connections between your surname and some famous mythological character or something. And I wouldn't, I'm not thinking of that sort of thing, but the court genealogists of the great houses of Britain and Ireland absolutely connected their patrons to mythical and legendary figures quite often. Is that the kind of thing you're asking me?
Yeah, I find that to be pretty interesting,
Mm-hmm.
like how we kind of like construct our history, specifically to these ancient mythological stories, some of which have these fantastic components of like ancient technology or magic or being descended from giants and things. So it's kind of like elements of the other world having like deep historical and ancestral context.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly in my study of the Old North, which I'm very fond of, we see kings interacting with gods, and we see this in the Irish corpus as well. People had a very different idea about reality than we do now. Everything has to be sort of materially proven, or we're not happy. And I just want to throw out another thought out into the conversation that can kind of foment in your mind, and you can speak about it if you want to. And that question is, was Pwyll set up? We start out the story with Pwyll having this sudden urge to go hunting, so much so that he doesn't even wait till morning. He sets out that evening, and spends the night, and then they hunt in the morning. And then he immediately becomes separated from his huntsmen. You'd think they'd be taking better care of their ruler than that. Then immediately finds around and his dogs doing their thing. Is this a coincidence? Is this a story of somebody who accidentally this happened to? Or is this a story of around thinking, how am I going to help this young ruler of Dyfed be a better ruler? What will be the method by which I will draw him in to my world? So that's just a thought to throw out to you. Also, in response for the genealogical question, there's a thing called the Welsh Classical Dictionary. The author is Peter Bartram, Rum, I think, Bartram. And you can find it on archive.org or through the National Library of Wales website. Peter Bartram was an amazing genealogist of all the old Welsh genealogies and things. So there's a lot of genealogical information in the Welsh Classical Dictionary, plus a lot of information about any character from the Mabinogi or the Old North or even early historical characters. So it's a really useful reference book. It's a reference book. It's not something you read from cover to cover. And Peter Bartram also wrote another book called Early Welsh Genealogical Tracts. It's not easy to get hold of, but it's one to look for if you're interested in that kind of stuff.
Thanks, I appreciate that. And I'll also look to your sources list. Real quick, I'm just wondering, in the Mabinogion, like I hear about the kings of Ireland, the kings of Britain, like how did the Scottish come into the story? Like I haven't fully finished it, but what do you think about that?
Well, how do the Scottish come into the Mabinogion? Not, they don't really.
So on what you were just saying, perhaps he was set up in a positive sense, set up, in order to become a better king, or a better ruler. I'm thinking of the potential acknowledgement of that there was an interconnectedness between the other worlds and their world, and perhaps the story was written in such a way that it implies, can't remember the name of the one who he assumed the role of. What was it? Around, yeah. I'm having difficulty remembering them because they're new words to me and new languages. So, perhaps around, in order to improve his own state of being within the other worlds, did have to, in fact, assist Pwyll to become better, so that he could, ascend in hierarchy or within this other world. And in the negative sense of being set up, I was also thinking, this will be a bit of thinking out loud. From the way it was written, it seemed like everything Pwyll, went through in the other world until the point of striking down Gawif, experiential, right? Afghan, right? It was all seemed to all be experiential. It was all, experiencing good food, experiencing being bathed, all of these things, and then it mentions him, rolling over rather than sleeping with the queen. Perhaps he wasn't even in control until the point of this striking down, right? Perhaps it was the one who he assumed the role of was doing all of the controlling in both realities. And I have a question as well. Other stories I've read about people spending time in another world, there seems to be a time dilation between the two, right? And there is not in this story.
No, there's not. And I think there isn't always, but there certainly can be.
I don't see any accidents in police involvement in the other world. I think he's set up in a quote good way, but why? Why him? What's making him the one that has to be the doer? Why is this his journey? What's his connection to the other world? Is it just because he happened upon him at that time, or is there something deeper there?
The word Annwfn, which is the Welsh word for the other world, it's a kind of a difficult word to parse all of its meanings. But one meaning is like it's the deep place or the deep world. It's not deep in the sense of underground. It's deep in reality, deeper in some kind of reality that we're not quite in, but the two bleed into one another. So it's possible that the other world feels some kind of discomfort or desire to meddle if they feel that this other world, our world, that's also bleeding into theirs, isn't working right. Or at least that's the cosmological idea that's being put forth in the mythology. There are a couple of reasons why we have so many stories about kings going to the other world. One is, the keepers of the mythology were in the employment of the nobility or lived among the nobility. But the other one is that people tended to see their kings not as divine, but as sacred. Yeah. there's a difference. Yeah, you get the difference. They don't see them as gods, but they see them as sacred because they're doing a sacred work of kingship or rulership. And therefore, it would be expected that the other world would take some kind of an interest in the rulers.
Basically, two sides to the same coin because our realities are, in a sense, intertwined with each other at all times. There's no separation. It's not like the other world is another place off in yonder Pluto planet. It's here with us at all times.
Yeah, exactly. It's it's numinous. It's here. Yeah, great. So I'm going to stop there. And if you're wondering what taking a class with me is like, it's a bit like this. It's nice to just interact with more people. And like someone said, a lot of us are just hungry for some more intellectual type conversation about these myths rather than, maybe what you find mostly on TikTok or something, or in some of the books that are around and have been around for decades. There are some good ones and there are lots of not so good ones. So this is basically what the classes are like, except you may have to do some reading assignments. Yeah, thanks very much for coming. It's been great. Bye-bye for now.